Okay, this is a video about how the fingers work when you're playing the guitar. So, here we have basic anatomy lesson, okay? Obviously, here's your thumb, metacarpal. These are the metacarpals down here, and then these are the phalanges. There's one phalanx there, there's the proximal phalanx, the middle phalanx, and the distal phalanx here. So these are called the interphalangeal joints, or the IP joints, and this is the distal interphalangeal joint, and that's the proximal phalangeal joint, or the PIP joint and the DIP joint, and this is the metacarpophalangeal joint here, or the MCP joint, or the first knuckle, okay? Now, you've got some muscles here between the bones called the interosseous muscles, and then you've got the big muscles in the forearm here, like the extensors coming along here, which come over the back of these joints and extend your fingers. And then you've got flexors, two lots of them, deep flexors or profundus flexors and superficialis flexors that go through the carpal tunnel and come down underneath this metacarpal and pass through pulleys all the way down your finger on this side, flexing these joints here. And flex all three of these joints here like this. Now, if the long flexor, which is outside your hand, so we call it the extrinsic muscles, was to act on its own, the long flexor, then you just get simple, what we call composite flexion. Everything flexes, bend, bend, bend. Yeah. Now, it gets a bit more complicated with the extensor mechanism, because the extensor tendon coming along here will extend this joint, fair enough, but it doesn't do a very good job extending these two. And you've got these very special muscles here, which are actually inside the hand, so they're called the intrinsic muscles, and a major group of those are the interosseous muscles. There's also lumbricals in here. And what they do is they pass on the palm side of this joint, and they pass on the back side of that joint and that joint behind the axis of rotation marked with a little cross here. So when your intrinsic muscles, the interosseous muscles, contract, they tend to flex at this joint. I think you can see how that would do that because it's on that side of the X, and it extend at these two joints, and that allows you to do a bar chord. So your little muscle in here, the little muscles inside the hands, are the ones that do bar chords in the index finger, and if you're doing straightening of the other fingers at any point, like your ring finger here, and you're doing little bar chords with that, then similarly the intrinsics are contracting, and that's called the intrinsic plus position, when you're bending at the MCP joint and straightening at the other two, and that's working these little muscles in the hand here really hard and making them straighten these joints and bend that one. Now, in order to do that, you need to relax your extensor tendon here, contract the intrinsic muscle, and the flexor tendon doesn't need to do very much work. The extrinsic muscle, the big, bulky, strong one up here, doesn't have to do very much work at all. And if you do contract that hard, then whilst it will flex this joint, it'll try to flex these as well, and the intrinsic muscles here will have to be fighting hard against it to try to keep these two joints straight. So there's a conflict there. And if the flexor tendon's flexing hard as well, then the extensor tendon will be having to work a little bit as well against that. So you end up with a situation where you have a lot of tension and muscles acting against each other antagonistically. So that's an intrinsic plus position going into the bar chord position. Whereas if you're playing something like this, like an open chord, for example, a C shape, then you may find yourself, with your finger very flexed, you might find yourself extending at this joint and flexing at these two joints. And in order to do that, you need to not only relax these intrinsic tendons, but you also need them to be very supple. And if they're a bit tight, and you can't do this, then you'll have to work even harder with your long flexor tendon coming down here to bend that down, and then your extensor tendon working really hard here to work against these tight intrinsic muscles. So in my previous video on finger yoga that's on my website, there's a talk about how you can relax these intrinsic muscles, which are often very tight. You can relax these muscles by doing some stretches and learn how to not contract them. And Paul Anders Sogard is very good at telling patients how not to have tension in their hand when they're playing the guitar. And so for those chords where you need to bring your fingers right down like this into that position, you need to have supple, soft, intrinsic muscles to allow that to extend. So essentially you also have you have this composite flexion movement, which is just the long flexor, the extrinsic, bending all three joints. Then you have the situation where this joint is extending and these two are flexing, and that's a combination of the long flexor and the extensor with the intrinsic muscles being completely relaxed. So that's the intrinsic minus position. And then you have the situation where the intrinsic plus position, where the intrinsics are working really hard and they go into this position. Now what I haven't told you yet is the intrinsics also have the action of, when they work in isolation, they can move the finger side to side. So these little muscles here also move the finger side to side, and if they both act together, then they straighten the joint. But if they act one at a time, they straighten the joint and move the finger to the side. And because these intrinsic muscles here between the bones, the interosseous muscles and the lumbricals, work so hard, they need stretching. They get exhausted and they need stretching out because otherwise they tend to contract, just like any sort of yoga that you do after a workout. And so it's really important to do some stretches on those. And now you can see how all these three main components, the extensors, the flexors, both of which are extrinsic, and then the intrinsic muscles, causing this rather complicated movement like that, where you're flexing here and extending here. That's essentially how the finger works when you're playing the guitar, bar chords and other chords. And they may be doing different things in different fingers, of course. So give them a break. They work really hard.